Welcome to today's webinar. On behalf of the National Transit Institute, I welcome you and thank everyone for participating. The National Transit Institute develops, promotes, and delivers training and education programs for the public transit industry in the United States. Today's webinar is National Transit Database Annual Asset Inventory Module Reporting, which is slightly different than it says on the screen, but it's basically the same thing. We're pleased to have as our main presenter today, Melissa Conti, with support from Mishadoni Smith and question and answer support from Joe Eldridge. Melissa Conti joined the NTD team in 2015. She is a graduate of James Madison University and currently works as a senior validation analyst across urban and rural reporting modules of the National Transit Database. Mishadoni Smith has over 20 years experience in transportation civil engineering. She manages Federal Transit Administration's Division of Analysis, which covers the Conditions and Performance, CMP, report development, the National Transit Database, NTD, and Transit Asset Management, TAM, programs. Dr. Smith received her undergraduate and master's degrees from Michigan State University and her doctorate from the Georgia Institute of Technology in 2010. Joe Eldridge serves as the project manager for the NTD Validation Services team, a primary duty of which is to manage the NTD Operations Center staff. He has 10 years of experience in the public transit industry and holds a Bachelor's of Science in Systems Engineering Psychology from the University of Virginia. So for today's presentation, Melissa and Mishadoni will be presenting the slides. And if you have questions at any time, you can type them in the Q&A box, and Joe should be able to help you out with that. If we have time at the end, I will moderate the questions that are still outstanding in the Q&A box, if there are any. If you don't see the Q&A box, it should be on the bottom where your Zoom controls are. There's also a chat box. I know sometimes it's tempting to put the questions in the chat box. I'll look for them there, but we would really prefer that they be put in the Q&A box if you can do that. It's helpful. And then we have a record of them for anyone who wants them. If you haven't obtained or printed out a copy of the presentation, the link was in the email that was sent out to you, but I will also be putting it in the chat box so you can download it there as well. So I think that takes care of all the housekeeping. I'm now going to turn everything over to Melissa.
All right, thanks, Lori, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this presentation on the National Transit Database Asset Inventory Module. Like Lori said, if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A chat pod, and then Joe should be able to answer those, but pending time, we may be able to cover some of them at the end of the presentation. All right, so here's the contact information for the National Transit Database. If at any point you require technical assistance while completing your report or accessing our published data products, please feel free to call or email our help desk line. We're open from 8 a.m. to 7 p.m. Eastern time. I'd also suggest if you're associated with a transit agency, you can contact your analyst first, and then if it's after hours, you can always call or email the help desk. The goal of this webinar is to review the asset forms for the National Transit Database report, and we're going to do that by reviewing requirements that were implemented in report year 2018, as well as discuss existing requirements. We will also be reviewing how the NTD asset inventory relates to the Transit Asset Management, or TAM rule. As Lori mentioned, my name is Melissa Conti, and I'm joined here today by Mishadoni Smith from FTA, who will also be presenting today. Our contact information is listed here if you have any questions, or like I said, you can always contact your assigned NTD analyst. Some additional contacts, we have Tom Coleman, who is the NTD program manager. And we also have, like Lori mentioned, Joe Eldridge here for Q&A support, who is the NTD Operations Center manager. Okay, so a little agenda for this afternoon. We're going to start with reviewing the asset inventory module and the TAM rule. Then we'll move on to the A90 performance measure targets form and a review of target setting. And then last part of the presentation, we're going to go through each of the asset inventory forms on the NTD report and how to complete each form. Okay, I'm going to briefly turn the presentation over to Ms. Shidoni to review the Tam Rule.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you for inviting me to give a little bit of background about the Tam Rule. Many of you are probably already familiar, but it's always nice to kind of know where this requirement started. So MAP 21 mandated that FTA develop a transit asset management regulation, and the FAST Act also reaffirmed that requirement. So in 2016, we published what's called the Tam Final Rule, and it can be found at the link at the bottom of your screen. In addition to this resource, there's also a TAM webpage for frequently asked questions and other TAM-related questions. The rule itself outlines what the requirements are, and the process to get to the final rule included a Federal Register notice for comment and information from the public, in which we responded to all of those comments and came up with the final regulation. Next slide. Thank you. So the applicability of the TAM rule is it applies to all recipients of Chapter 53 who own, operate, or manage capital assets. For the NTD audience, that means agencies that receive 5307 and 5311 funds, as well as agencies that receive 5310 report their asset inventories to the NTD. They must own, operate, or manage public transit. And specifically with regard to the 5310 subrecipients, we wanted to clarify that it has to be providers of public transportation. The reference you see there just provides a little bit more information and details about that. But I'd also direct you to go to the frequently asked questions on the TAM webpage that outline a lot of these applicability questions. Next slide. I also wanted to briefly highlight the Tam Phase-in Schedule. So from 2016, when the rule became final till today, we've been phasing in some of the requirements. You will note that across the board, all of the columns are required now, but there are certain requirements that are being phased in, specifically the facility condition assessments. For this report year, I want to bring your attention to the 50% requirement for condition assessments. This is slightly adjusted due to the environment that we're currently working in now. Joe, thank you for posting the TAM webpage to the chat. Previously, we were requiring 3/4 or 75% of your facilities to be reported to the NTD this year, but we have eased that requirement and now it's only 50%. However, 100% will be required next report year as previously reported. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Melissa.
All right, thanks, Mish. I appreciate you reviewing those slides. So next, we're going to review the role of the NTD and move on to target setting. The NTD asset inventory is going to be one requirement as part of that TAM rule. There are other requirements outside of NTD reporting for your TAM plan, but the NTD's role is really to serve as a data collector for the asset inventory data and the associated condition data for those assets. There are two items, the A90 targets form and the narrative report, that the NTD collects as part of your agency's TAM plan. When FTA accepts and closes out your agency's annual NTD report, this does not constitute approval of your TAM plan. The TAM plan is still subject to review by FTA, and as I mentioned earlier, and Mish mentioned as well, there are other requirements outside of the NTD. Some resources like Mish mentioned for the TAM program, you can visit the TAM program website, and there are a slew of resources, FAQs, regional contact information, webinars, as well as some trainings. And then for the NTD portion, the asset inventory page, we have some guidebooks on condition assessments and performance restrictions, general asset form templates, and then we also have webinars and trainings that are specific to NTD. With the expanded asset inventory that was introduced in report year 2018, there were a couple of changes to some of the existing asset forms, and we also added a couple of new forms. The A30 revenue vehicle inventory form was updated to include some additional fields, and the A20 Transitway mileage form was amended to include a new section for additional information on rail modes and guideway. There were 3 new forms added to the NTD as a result of the Tam Rule and the expanded asset inventory, and this became a requirement in report year 2018. The first is the Transit Asset Management Facilities Inventory, or A15 form, the Transit Asset Management Service Vehicle Inventory, or A35 form, and lastly, the Transit Asset Management Performance Measure Targets, or A90 form. We will mention capital responsibility multiple times throughout this presentation with regards to the asset module. Please see the list here of how to determine whether or not your agency has direct capital responsibility for an asset. If you own, jointly own, or you are responsible for replacing, overhauling, refurbishing, or conducting major repairs on an asset, or the cost of those activities are itemized as a capital line item in your agency's budget, that would indicate capital responsibility. Please note that performing minimal preventative maintenance work does not necessarily indicate direct capital responsibility for an asset. The first form we will review is the A90 Transit Asset Management Performance Measure Targets form. The A90 is where your agency will report targets from your Transit Asset Management, or TAM plan. The form has a field for each applicable asset type. It will pull in your agency's current performance for each asset type based on what you report in your asset forms. For your reference, the prior year's target is also pulled into the form. If your agency is participating in a group TAM plan, you do not need to fill out the A90 form. Your group plan sponsor will complete one A90 form for the entire group and its participants. FTA defines a target as the goal associated with performance that is used to track progress of capital assets towards achieving a state of good repair. This is a quantifiable level of performance or condition expressed as a value of measure to be achieved within a time period as required by FTA. Target setting is considered to be a local decision for each agency. Targets should be based on realistic expectations, available data, and expected financial resources from all sources in the upcoming year. When setting targets, agencies should consider their ability to improve or maintain the current state of its capital assets, as well as the perception of the intended audience when determining how high or how low to set a target. Please note, though, that the Tam Final Rule does not lay out any penalties for missing targets and also does not set out any rewards for attaining a target. For further resources and assistance with target setting, you can reference the links here on this slide. There are several resources, including Tam Peer Library, fact sheets, and instructions on how to complete the A90, which we will also be reviewing in the upcoming slides. Next, we will review the performance measures for each asset type and how this is calculated on the A90 form. The performance measure for rolling stock or revenue vehicle inventory and the equipment section or service vehicle inventory are based on the same measure, the percentage of vehicles that have met or exceeded their useful life benchmark. The facility section, which corresponds to the facilities inventory, is based on the percentage of facilities that rate below a 3 on the term or transit economics requirements model scale. Lastly, for any rail providers, the performance measure is based on the percentage of track miles under a performance restriction. Please note that the infrastructure section will have one target for each rail mode. The A90 form has 5 elements. We're going to go over each of those fields just so you have a better understanding of what is shown on the form and what is expected for your agency to fill out. we have our current year target, current year performance, the difference between those two values, next year's target, and the NA or not applicable column. The current year target will populate based on what your agency reported in the previous NTD report year. Since the A90 form looks ahead, agencies will report targets for the upcoming fiscal year. The current target is actually going to be the year set from the previous NTD report year. The current year performance is a system calculation on the percentages of assets that are not in a state of good repair based on what your agency is reporting in the corresponding asset forms. The difference column will be the current year target minus the current year performance to show the difference between the target your agency set and how your assets are actually performing. The next year target will be the field that you will be required to report on in the current report year, and you'll enter a value that will correspond to the target for the upcoming fiscal year. Lastly, the NA column is where your agency can select a checkbox for not applicable for any asset types that your agency does not have or does not have a target for. Okay, so now we're going to go over the 4 sections of the A90 and how the A90 is calculating the performance based on the information reported in your asset forms. So we're going to start with the rolling stock section, which is the first section on the form. This section corresponds to your agency's A30 revenue vehicle inventory forms. This is where you will report targets for your applicable asset types, in this case, vehicle types. The A90 form calculates the current performance by taking the total number of dedicated active vehicles that have met or exceeded their set useful life benchmark and divides by the total number of dedicated active vehicles with a useful life benchmark reported. This is done for each applicable vehicle type on the form. The example here on the slide has an agency that's reporting 8 active dedicated cutaway vehicles that they own and use for their own transit service. The agency in the example is using a useful life benchmark of 10 years for the cutaway vehicle type. 2 of these cutaways were manufactured in 2006, 2 of the cutaways were manufactured in 2009, and 4 of the cutaways were manufactured in 2015. Based on that information that would be reported in the A30 revenue vehicle inventory form, the current performance for the cutaway asset type on the A90 would be 50%. 4 of the 8 reported cutaways have met or exceeded their useful life benchmark. On the A90 form, as you can see at the bottom of the slide here, it will show 50% in the current performance column. And here it shows the year. So every year you will see the corresponding year. So 2019, that would be the current year performance for report year 2019, and those will update based on the NTD report year. Next is the equipment section, which corresponds to your agency's A35 service vehicle inventory. This section has 3 target fields, 1 for each service vehicle type. Similar to the rolling stock or revenue vehicle inventory section, this section on the A90 calculates performance by taking the total number of vehicles that have met or exceeded their reported useful life benchmark with capital responsibility and divides by the total number of vehicles with capital responsibility and a useful life benchmark reported. For the example on this slide, we have an agency who is reporting 4 vehicles under the trucks and other rubber tire vehicle types. They use these vehicles to support their transit operations. They are reporting a useful life benchmark for trucks and other rubber tire vehicle of 14 years. 3 of the trucks were manufactured in 2011, and 1 of the trucks was manufactured in 2000. The A90 is showing a current performance for this asset type of 25%. This is because 1 of the 4 reported trucks has met or exceeded its useful life benchmark. This would be the truck that's manufactured in 2000. The other 3 trucks manufactured in 2011 still have useful life remaining and therefore are in a state of good repair. For the facility section, you will report 2 targets if applicable. one for passenger and parking facilities, and one for administrative and maintenance facilities. This section of the A90 form corresponds to your agency's A15 Transit Asset Management Facilities Inventory form. The calculation for current performance is the total number of facilities with a rating of a 1 or a 2 on the term scale with capital responsibility divided by the total number of facilities with a condition assessment reported and capital responsibility. Please note that the A90 does not include any facilities that do not have a condition assessment reported. In the example here on the slide, we are looking at the administrative or maintenance facilities category. The agency in our example has 12 admin maintenance facilities. 5 of those scored a 3 on the term scale. 4 of them scored a 4 on the term scale. 1 of them was rated a 1 on the term scale, and 2 of the facilities do not yet have condition assessments. The current performance for this admin and maintenance category that the A90 would automatically calculate is 10%. We're getting that 10% calculation by taking the total admin maintenance facilities with a condition assessment below 3, which is 1. We have 1 facility scoring a 1. And then we're going to divide that by the total number of admin maintenance facilities with a reported condition assessment score, which is 10, since we have 2 of them that have not been assessed yet. We wouldn't include those in the calculation. This leaves us with 1 divided by 10, and then turned into a percentage is 10%. The last section on the A90 form is infrastructure. This corresponds to any rail modes that your agency has on the A20 Transitway mileage form. This section of the form will only show up for agencies that are reporting rail. If you're not reporting a rail mode, you will not see this section on your A90. The current performance for the section is calculated by taking the total track miles under performance restrictions used in revenue service with capital responsibility and dividing by the total track miles used in revenue service with capital responsibility. This calculation only takes into account track miles used in revenue service. It does not include non-revenue service or any revenue track with no capital responsibility. The example here is an agency with 15 miles of tangent revenue track and 5 miles of curve revenue track. The agency has capital responsibility for all of their track. They have determined that 3.3 of these miles are determined to be under performance restrictions. So the form calculates the current performance by taking 3.3 and dividing by 20. And here we have 16.5%. It does appear that there is a typo on the slide regarding the decimal. So that 1.65 should actually read to be 16.5. And we're getting that calculation again by taking the 3.3 track miles under performance restrictions and dividing by our total track miles with capital responsibility that are used in revenue service. On the A90 form, you should be reporting a target for applicable asset types. If you're reporting a revenue vehicle or service vehicle with a useful life benchmark and have capital responsibility, you should have a target for that corresponding vehicle type. If you're reporting a condition assessment for the facilities that you have capital responsibility for, you again should have a corresponding target for that particular facility type on the A90. And the last item is going to be track. If you're reporting any revenue track with capital responsibility, you should have an infrastructure target at the bottom of the A90 for your applicable rail modes. For any asset types that do not apply to your agency, please ensure that you select the NA checkbox. This will indicate that you do not have any assets of that type or you do not have a target for that type. There could be a couple reasons why you may not have a target for a particular asset type. As I already mentioned, this may be because your agency does not have any of that particular asset type. You may not have capital responsibility for any assets of that type, or you may not anticipate using that particular asset type in the upcoming year and therefore do not have an applicable target. The targets your agency sets should be mathematically possible. We're going to review an example here of what we mean by that. If you're only reporting 2 facilities of the admin and maintenance type, the possible targets that your agency could set would be 0% if both of the facilities score a 3 or above on the term scale, meaning that 0% of your 2 facilities are not in a state of good repair. 50% if one of those facilities scored a 3 or above on the term scale, meaning that 50% of your facilities are not in a state of good repair. Or the last option would be 100%, meaning that neither facility scores above a 3 on the term scale, and in turn means that 100% of your facilities are not in a state of good repair. So this is something to think about when you're filling out the form. Like I mentioned, the target should represent the percentage of assets that you expect to not be in a state of good repair in the upcoming fiscal year. Sometimes agencies may report the opposite amount, or what we would refer to as the mirror target. So they may report the amount they do expect to be in a state of good repair. For a quick example, if an agency expects 10% of their passenger facilities to not be in a state of good repair, and they report 90%, this would be an example of what we refer to as a mirror target. We would be looking for the agency to report the 10%, which is the percentage that will not be in a state of good repair, versus the flip side of that, which is the 90%, that represents the 90% of their facilities that are in a state of good repair. So again, just to reiterate, there we would be looking for a 10% target there versus the flip side, which would be 90%. The narrative report is the last item on the A90 form. This is a document that should review the targets your agency set and any progress made towards those targets. You may include any changes in your transit system conditions or any other extenuating circumstances that affected progress towards your targets. There's no prescriptive format for this document. However, FTA did develop a template you can use as a guide for this narrative report. It can be found on the FTA website, and there's also a link here on the slide. You can upload this document to the bottom of the A90 form. Please ensure that this is your agency's narrative report specifically and not your entire TAM plan. Targets referenced in the document should match what you are reporting to the NTD in the A90 form. Okay, so the next half of the presentation is going to be reviewing each of the asset forms that your agency reports to the NTD. So we're going to start with the A10 Stations and Maintenance Facilities form. The A10 captures a count of passenger stations and the type and number of maintenance facilities used for public transit. You will report one A10 form for each mode and type of service that your agency operates, with the exception of TX or TN modes. Passenger facilities are only reportable on the A10 form if they meet the station criteria listed here. Please note that historically, stations for non-fixed guideway modes were only reportable if they were enclosed. In report year 2019, FTA clarified that stations do not need to be enclosed to be reportable, but rather a significant structure. With that being said, bus shelters or bus stops without a significant structure are not reportable to the NTD on this form. To complete the station portion of the A10 form, you will enter the number of passenger stations, broken out by ADA accessible stations and non-ADA accessible stations. Once you have entered a count, then you will report the count of elevators and escalators in those stations. Next, you will report a count of maintenance facilities. Maintenance facilities are reported by capacity and by ownership type. And the definition of maintenance facility is a garage or building where mechanics perform routine maintenance and repairs and typically service as operating garages. Please note that we would not include bus barns in this count or any third-party facility where you would take your vehicle to get serviced, such as a Jiffy Lube or any other private maintenance facilities. If one maintenance facility for your agency is shared between 2 or more modes, you will report a prorated share between the modes involved. This could be based on any point that is reflective of how much the facility is used per mode. But one of the most common approaches is using the number of vehicles it services for each mode. For example, if an agency owns one facility and operates both demand response and fixed route bus service, both modes share the facility and they own a total of 20 vehicles. The demand response mode operates 15 of those vehicles, and the bus mode operates 5 of those vehicles. In this example, we would expect to see 0.75 reported in the demand response A10 form and 0.25 in the bus A10 form. When allocating your maintenance facilities across the multiple A10 forms, please ensure that overall it adds up to a whole number. The next form we're going to review is the A15 Transit Asset Management Facilities Inventory form. So this was a new form in report year 2018. The A15 form collects basic information on passenger facilities as well as admin or maintenance facilities. On this form, you will report admin or maintenance facilities for which you have capital responsibility for, and the use of the facility for transit is greater than incidental. You will report all passenger and parking facilities used in revenue service, regardless of your capital responsibility. To review, an agency has capital responsibility for an asset when they own, jointly own, or are responsible for replacing or conducting major repairs on the asset, or the cost of those activities are itemized as a capital line item in your budget. There are many facility type options for both administrative and maintenance facilities and passenger facilities. Please review the options in the NTD policy manual and choose the best fit for your facilities. If you're unsure which facility type to select, please feel free to ask your analyst and provide a description of the facility or pictures of the facility. There are 3 sections to complete on the A15 form for each of the facilities that you add to the form. We have the facility information section, condition assessment section, and lastly, the address section. To add a new facility on the A15 form, you will first click on the Add New button at the top left. Then you will click on the Add Facility link that's shown here in the red circle. This will then allow you to start entering data for the facility. The first field is going to be the facility name. Here's where you can enter an agency-specific name for the facility that will help you identify the entry. Next, you will report the primary mode that services the facility. The form will populate a list of available modes that your agency is reporting that you can then select from. For any additional modes that also serve the facility, you can add these under the secondary mode field by entering the mode acronym. For example, demand response is DR and motor bus would be MB. It's at your agency's discretion which modes you would like to report as one for primary and then which ones you would like to designate as secondary. If your agency's facility is shared or serviced by any private modes of transportation, such as bus, rail, or airport, you can add the private mode section to the entry. Some examples of this may be Amtrak or Greyhound. Next, you will select the facility type. There are several facility types for passenger facilities and administrative or maintenance facilities. If you cannot find a facility type that fits your facility, you may report other, but you will be required to describe the facility in the notes section if that's the case. Your analyst will then review these notes that you've added to describe the facility and will determine with you if there's a more specific facility type that is appropriate. As I mentioned before, there are examples of each of these facility types in the NTD policy manual that you can review. Once you have selected the facility type, you're now going to enter the details for the facility. This includes the year built or reconstructed as new, square feet, or parking spaces if the facility type is a parking facility option. And then lastly, you will report your agency's percent of capital responsibility for the facility. The note section here is optional unless you have selected an other facility type. You can include any notes about the facility here for your own reference that can help you identify entries on your form. The next section is the condition assessment section. For any facilities that your agency has capital responsibility for, you are required to report a condition assessment. The number of condition assessments required were phased in since the beginning of the mandatory asset reporting, starting with the 25% in report year 2018, 50% in report year 2019, and so on. As Mish mentioned in the beginning of this presentation, for report year 2020, due to the pandemic, FTA has delayed the 75% requirement, and only 50% of your agency's required condition assessments need to be reported for this report year. Please note that 100% of them will be required for report year 2021. To fill out this part of the form, you will select the term scale score for the facility from the drop-down menu. If you are not reporting a condition assessment for the current report year, or you do not have capital responsibility for this particular facility, you must select NA from the drop-down menu. Once you have selected the term scale score, you will then enter the date the condition assessment was performed. Please note that the reported condition assessment should have been performed prior to the fiscal year end of the current report year. The last section is the address section. Here you can report either the address of the facility or the longitude and latitude. If the facility is a section of a larger facility and physically attached to another building, you can select the checkbox here on this part of the form. You may need to inventory different sections of a facility due to significant age differences, differences in condition, or differences in function. You should only select this checkbox for section of a larger facility if the buildings are physically attached. If you have a compound with multiple buildings on the same piece of land, but they are not physically touching one another, you should not select this section of a larger facility box. The A15 form will populate with any facilities that you reported in the previous year. If you need to edit an existing entry, you can either click on the blue link of the facility name and then scroll down to edit the facility details, or you could select the checkbox next to the facility and then click Edit Selected. Once you are done updating your facility's inventory for the year, you can then click the Save and Validate button at the bottom of the form. Now we're going to cover the A30 Revenue Vehicle Inventory form. This is where you will report all revenue vehicle data that is categorized in fleets. As I said with the A15 form, any data that you entered into this form in the previous report year will pre-populate. You will report one A30 form per mode and type of service. You only need to report any new fleets or edit existing fleets. You can enter new fleets by clicking Add New Fleet, or you can edit an existing fleet by clicking on the RVI ID number. The first section to complete for a new fleet is the basic information. A vehicle fleet may consist of more than one vehicle as long as all of the characteristics are identical across the vehicles. The notes section and agency fleet ID field are optional. You may use these fields to help report any internal identifiers for the vehicle fleets. Next, you will report the vehicle type. Some examples of vehicle type are cutaway, van, or bus. These options will populate based on the type of mode you are reporting. Now, next on the form, you'll report the total vehicles in the fleet and then the active vehicles in the fleet. The A30 form should capture your agency's revenue vehicle inventory on the last day of the fiscal year. The total vehicles state how many total vehicles there are in the fleet that all have the same characteristics. The active fleet vehicles are how many vehicles are active as of the last day of the fiscal year you are reporting on. A common question we receive is, what is the difference between active and inactive vehicles? Transit agencies must report the number of active vehicles for each fleet, and these are ones that provide regular service and include spare vehicles. Inactive vehicles are ones that are awaiting sale or disposal, are in storage, are part of an FTA-approved emergency contingency plan, or they may be out for major repairs. Next, you will select the ownership type for the fleet, where you will indicate whether the fleet is owned or leased by your agency and whether you are a public or private entity. Funding type is the next field, and this should reflect the major source of funding that was used for the vehicle fleet. The last two items on the basic information section are two checkboxes. The first is to indicate if your agency does not have capital replacement responsibility for this particular vehicle fleet. The second one is to indicate if the fleet has automated or autonomous vehicles. The second section you will complete is for the fleet vehicle details. This will include the model and manufacturer, vehicle length, which should be reported in feet, seating and standing capacity, fuel type, and year of manufacture. Please note that the year of manufacture should represent the true year of manufacture and not the model year for the vehicles. Please note that model and manufacturer are only required in the urban module. Some of these requirements may be different for rural reporters. Next, you will complete the useful life benchmark field for any vehicles for which you have capital responsibility. This field became required in report year 2018. Please note that if you select no capital replacement responsibility for the fleet in the basic section, this field for useful life benchmark will not apply. This field will automatically populate with the FTA default based on the vehicle type, but agencies may report their own useful life benchmark based on their TAM plan. The example here on this slide shows a bus, and the FTA default is listed below the field here, and we see that it's 14 years for a bus vehicle type. The useful life remaining field is automatically populated by the reporting system based on the year of manufacture and the reported useful life benchmark. And the example here shows a vehicle fleet that was manufactured in 2014 and has a useful life benchmark of 14. So the vehicle fleet for 2020 has 8 years of useful life remaining. Urban reporters are required to report mileage information for each vehicle fleet. This includes the miles this year, which is the sum of all miles put on the vehicles in the fleet during the fiscal year time period, and then the average lifetime miles, which represents the average total miles per active vehicle in the fleet. You can calculate average lifetime miles for a fleet one of two ways. If you reported the fleet in the previous year, you can take the miles this year for the current year, divide by the number of active vehicles, and add it to the prior year's average lifetime miles. The second method you can use is simply taking an average of all of the ending odometer readings for the active vehicles in the fleet. If you need to edit a fleet, you can click directly on the Revenue Vehicle Inventory ID or RVI ID number, and the information will populate below, and you can edit fields as needed. If your agency shares any fleets between your modes, you can add existing fleets from one A30 form to another A30 form. To do this, you can click on this Add Existing Fleet button and then select the shared fleets that you would like to report. The system will populate a list of the other fleets from the other A30 forms, and you can select which ones you need to add to this current A30 form. Please note that you should retire fleets that are no longer in service rather than deleting them. Fleets should only be deleted from the A30 form if they were added to the mode incorrectly. To retire a fleet, you will update active vehicles to 0. And once that occurs, the question, "Is this fleet retired?" will appear at the bottom right of the form, and you can select yes. In the following report year, the retired fleet will be removed from the A30 form. Please do not edit a fleet that was disposed of with the information of a new fleet. This would give the fleets the same ID number, which can cause confusion. If a fleet is disposed of, please retire the fleet as mentioned, and then you can add a new fleet with a new RVI ID number. Next is the service vehicle inventory form, where we collect an inventory of service vehicles used to support transit service but not carry passengers. This will be your A35 form. Agencies are required to report on fleets for which they have capital responsibility on the A35 form. Service vehicles include cars used for admin staff, transit police cars, and tow trucks. However, it should not include things such as small forklifts and golf carts. As mentioned, this is where we collect service vehicles that are used to indirectly deliver transit service and support operations. Please note that revenue vehicles that perform actual transit service and carry passengers would be reported on the A30 form, the form we just reviewed, rather than the A35 form. If your agency doesn't have any service vehicles that you have capital responsibility for, you just need to save this form blank in your report package. There are 3 vehicle type categories on the A35 form. We first have automobiles, which are passenger cars, including anything the size of a station wagon or smaller. Minivans and larger vehicles should be reported under the trucks and other rubber tire vehicles category. Trucks and other rubber tire vehicles include SUVs, minivans, trucks, and any other large vehicles with rubber tires. The last vehicle type is steel wheel vehicles, which include tampers or other rail support vehicles. To add a new service vehicle fleet, you'll click Add New on the form. Service vehicle fleets should be reported in a similar manner to the A30 revenue vehicle fleets, as in the same vehicles with the same characteristics can be grouped together. Next, you will click on the blue link that says Add Service Fleet towards the bottom left. Once you do this, now you can start entering the information for the fleet. The first fields you will complete are the fleet name, which will be what your agency calls the fleet, and then the optional field of agency fleet ID. This may be helpful to add an agency fleet ID if you have one, so that way you can distinguish between the fleets that you are reporting. Next will be the primary and secondary mode. So again, the primary mode should represent the mode that the service vehicles primarily support. Any other modes that the fleets also support can be added as secondary modes. These options will populate based on your agency's active modes. Now you will select the vehicle type. There are the 3 options that we just reviewed a couple slides ago. So we have automobiles, trucks and other rubber tire vehicles, and steel wheel vehicles. If you're unsure of which one to select, you can always feel free to contact your analyst for guidance. Once you have selected the vehicle type, now you will enter the total number of vehicles for that particular fleet. Next is the useful life benchmark. This will pre-populate with the FTA default for the particular vehicle type that you selected, but you can update this to match your agency's specific useful life benchmark if it does differ from the FTA default. Now you will report the year manufactured for the vehicle fleet. Again, please note that this is not the model year, but the actual year that the vehicles were manufactured. The last section is the financial section for the vehicle fleet. The fleet name and fleet ID will carry over from the first section, and now you will report your agency's percentage of capital responsibility for the fleet. This should be in a percentage format from 0 to 100. Please note that service vehicles are only reportable if your agency has some level of capital responsibility for the fleet. The last part of this section will be the estimated cost and the year dollars of the estimated cost to replace the service vehicle fleet. These should be the most recent estimate for the full cost to replace the asset. If you do not have a recent estimate, you can report the original cost of the asset or its insured value. If you do report the original cost of the asset, you should report the year that you purchased the asset as the year dollars of estimated cost. When all information is entered for the fleet and you're on the summary page, you're going to click Save and Validate to save the information that you just entered. The last asset form we will review is the Transitway Mileage Form, or A20 form. This form is only applicable to agencies with fixed guideway or high-intensity bus segments. For reporters with bus fixed guideway or high-intensity bus segments, you will complete the section of the form for lane miles. This portion of the form did not change with the expanded asset inventory module. However, in Report Year 2018, for the asset inventory module, the rail section did change on this form. For bus modes, like I said, this did not change from previous report years, so you will report the lane miles for each applicable guideway class. There are 3 for bus. You'll have exclusive fixed guideway, exclusive high-intensity bus, and controlled access high-intensity bus. So this should look familiar if you've reported bus modes in the past. For rail modes, this will be a new section as of Report Year 2018. There are 3 sections to report for rail modes: guideway, power and signal, and track. Each mode and type of service for rail will have its own section to report these data for each particular section. First, we'll cover the guideway section. This section is going to capture information on your agency's guideway elements. There's a basic section, which includes track miles, expected service years when new, percent agency capital responsibility, and agency with shared responsibility, if applicable. The construction section is where you will report the amount of each guideway element in the age bucket in which it was constructed. You can break this down by percentage or track miles per age bucket. Here are some screenshots of the guideway section. There are 9 total guideway elements, which cover the type of guideway your rail is on. There are several types broken down by at-grade, elevated, and below-grade guideway. In the NTD policy manual, you can find examples of each of the 9 types of guideway elements. If a particular guideway element does not apply to your agency's mode, you can select the NA checkbox, which indicates that you do not have any data to report for that particular element. Next is the power and signal section. So this will be where you will report applicable power and signal elements such as substations, third rail, and train control and signaling. There are a total of 5 elements for this section. Similar to the Guideways section, you will have a basic section and a construction section. For substations, you will be required to report a count of substations, and for the other power and signal elements, you will indicate whether or not your agency has them for that particular mode, and then you would report the basic information such as expected years when new, percent agency capital responsibility, and agency with shared responsibility if applicable. For the construction section for power and signal, you can report the age for substations by either a percentage or quantity in the particular age buckets. For the other power and signal elements, you must report them across the appropriate age buckets by the percentage. Here again are some screenshots of the power and signal section. If you don't have a particular power and signal element for the mode that you're reporting on, similar to the Guideways section, you can select the NA checkbox, and that again will indicate that there is no data to report for that element. The last section of the A20 form is track. This is where you will report information about your agency's laid track, including tangent revenue track, curve revenue track, non-revenue track, which includes your side and yard track, and any revenue track for which your agency does not have capital responsibility for. You will report the amount of track miles for each applicable track type, expected service years when new, percent of capital responsibility, and agencies with shared responsibility if that applies. You will also report here the amount of track for the mode that is under performance restrictions. This is the performance measure for the infrastructure section of the A90 form that we reviewed in the beginning. A performance restriction is defined to exist on a segment when the maximum permissible speed for a transit vehicle is set to a value that is below the Guideways full service speed. FTA published a guidebook for determining performance restrictions, and you can find this on the NTD website for your reference. This value under performance restrictions should represent the total revenue track miles for which your agency has capital responsibility for that are under performance restrictions. This field does not include side or yard track or track that your agency does not have capital responsibility for. The performance on the A90 will calculate based on the information that's entered in your A20 Transitway mileage form. Although we discussed it earlier, it's important to review how it looks on the form and what values are being used in the calculation. The total of elements 15 and 16, which are your total revenue track, minus element 18 to remove any revenue track that you don't have capital responsibility for, that total is going to be your denominator for the calculation on the A90. This value should be equal to or greater than the amount of track miles that you report under performance restrictions. The last section of the A20 form for rail modes is the special track elements section. This collects a count of special track elements for each mode. Please note that this section was updated in Report Year 2019, and there are a couple of new elements that better reflect industry terminology. You will report the count of each applicable element, the expected service years when new, percent agency capital responsibility, and any agencies with shared responsibility if applicable. If you do not have a particular special track element, please click the NA checkbox to indicate that there is no data to report. Here's a screenshot of what the form looks like on this special track element section. Like I said, these were updated in Report Year 2019, and you can find examples of each of these special track elements in the NTD policy manual. Okay, that concludes our presentation. Like I said, thank you everyone for joining us today. The PowerPoint and presentation will be online for reference, as Lori mentioned at the beginning. So you can go back and look at these and use them as a reference for your NTD report. Or if you have specific questions for your agency, you can always contact your NTD analyst. If you're unsure who your NTD analyst is, you may contact our help desk line and we can help determine who your assigned analyst is, so you can contact them. So now I'm not sure if we have a couple minutes for questions, if there are additional questions.
Sure, we can go over questions. There's currently no open questions in the Q&A box, but if someone has one, please go ahead and type it in. We'll just wait a minute.
And Lori, while we're waiting too, I wanted to clarify something. A lot of good questions coming in. First of all, thank you all for the Q&A, and hopefully I've done an adequate answering them. A couple of stumpers, I think, too, that I had to go back and look at. But there was one about how to classify automobiles versus pickup trucks, or excuse me, versus trucks and other rubber tire vehicles. And one of the vehicles that you might think would go in both is pickup trucks. That'll actually be classified as a truck, and other rubber tired vehicle should not go under automobiles. And I answered, I can't remember who it was that asked, but I answered Suzanne, I think it was, incorrectly at the beginning, so I wanted to provide that clarity.
Great, thank you. I don't see any questions. I don't know if people are just typing slowly. Someone wrote in the chat box, or am I providing the recording? Yes, assuming it recorded properly and all is well, I should hope to post this on NTI's YouTube page within the next week or so. You should probably, I'll put the URL so you can have it in the chat box in 1 second. Suzanne's question on age calculation was not answered. Susan, was it in the, Suzanne, I'm sorry, not Susan.
Oh, it looked like Suzanne had a follow-up, so and I didn't
okay.
do that until just now, but I didn't answer the question. Her question is how to calculate the age of the vehicle in comparison to useful life benchmark. And she says the example uses the manufacturer year, but we use the year the vehicle was put into service. And I think there was a separate question too about this same concept, which is about how I think it's about surrounding how to calculate the performance measure and how NTD might be calculating that differently because we're using the end of the fiscal year to make that calculation. Melissa, correct me if I'm wrong. I think that's the determination you went over on the A30 for revenue vehicles. It's the vehicle age minus the year of manufacture.
Yeah, so I think I was just reading over it. So I think, yeah, it sounds like they're using internally the year that they put it into service versus the year that it was manufactured. So with that being off, you can download, Suzanne, you can download your A30 forms from the NTD, and that may be helpful in keeping internal records based on, the useful life remaining in the NTD versus your internal records. That may be something that's helpful. So you can compare them at least in terms of, what's in NTD versus your internal records.
Yeah, and this definitely seemed to be a shared concern. Sri had a similar question. Jonathan, had a similar comment. So I think, for NTD, it's doing exactly as Melissa said. But for TAM planning, it seems like some of you have, to me, it seems like you have better and more precise practices in place. We really don't want to interfere with that. So the fact that there is a discrepancy, you may see a different number in your TAM plan than what's in the NTD reporting system, is just a limitation of the system right now. We're not collecting the date that a vehicle fleet entered service. But they're really good comments, and I definitely think this one's worth circling back on with Michidoni and the TAM program at FTA.
Okay. There's, did we address, there's a, in the chat box from Greg, my company is just starting a rail side of our transit operation. Who should I contact to make sure we're on the right track? Did we?
I don't think we did, but Greg, if you're currently reporting to NTD, you can contact your NTD analyst to make sure that they're aware of the new rail mode and make sure that you guys add that to your report. But if you are unsure who your analyst is, please feel free to contact the help desk and we can give you their contact information.
And in the chat box, Bernie asked the panelists if there's additional questions, do we reach out to our analyst? And I said, yes, that was probably the best way to go about this. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Okay.
And then I think I see one more in the
chat. I keep scrolling.
Regarding information from the other agencies that have responsibility for track data. I would recommend, Renee, talking to your analyst about this. That would be something we would bring up with FTA if there's a recurring waiver, if you're unable to get that information. So I would just make sure that your analyst is in the loop and knows, what's going on with your report for 2020. And then they can always bring it to our supervisors at the team to discuss further.
Okay.
I think there's one last one that came in.
Is the RVI one or?
Yeah, so the vehicle counts are not duplicated in our data products. We do take into account they will share the same RVI ID number if they're shared between multiple modes. But you will see them duplicated one on each A30 form when you're reporting.
But also not in the calculation either. They're only counted once.
So yeah, good point, Joe.
Performance measure calculation. Yeah, that's a good question. Potential improvement to the system might be just one form where you select multiple modes for a fleet, but right now that's a difference between the revenue and service vehicle inventory. It's a good question.
Did we answer the one from Renee at the top there?
Yeah, we did.
Okay. Oh, okay. Renee, I will paste the link in the chat box right now for the PowerPoint. In case anyone else needs it, putting in there right now. Oh, thank you, Nathaniel. You have my back. Any other questions?
I found one more question scanning the chat that it looks like we missed from Debbie. How do you enter on the A15 if you expand an existing facility to double its size? And I'm not sure if I'm interpreting the question correctly, but I think you'll just need to change the size of the facility in terms of its square footage. But you'll leave the same row, same record in the inventory. Melissa, is that?
Yeah, you can do that. I would also say if it's an addition that has a different condition or year built, you could also enter two different entries, so one for each portion of the facility to better reflect the differences in age or condition. But I think that would depend on how the facility was added on to. But Debbie, you can talk to your analyst about how you want to do that, but I would say that's probably at your discretion which way you want to update that.
Okay. Thanks. Anybody else? Wait another minute or so. I always feel bad that I'm going to cut someone off while they're in the middle of typing madly, but I guess, I don't know, maybe get your question in earlier. Just kidding. All right. I'm going to call it because I don't think I don't think there's any more coming in. It'll show up if I'm wrong. So did anybody else have anything to add? Melissa, Joe?
Nope, just want to say thank you everyone for tuning in.
Yes.
I hope it was helpful.
Judging from the amount of questions, I would say that this is very helpful. People were very interested in the topic.
Agreed. Thank you, Lori, for hosting.
Thank you. Thank you both. This was great. Thank everyone for participating. Thank you to Melissa and Joe for presenting and answering questions, and Mishidoni, who had to step away. We appreciate her input as well. A reminder to everyone still listening, you will be getting an email probably tomorrow with a link to a survey. Please take a couple of minutes and fill that out for us. Your feedback is very helpful. We really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon. Bye.